How can we learn from the leaders, educators, and experts in our industry? What can we take away from their successes and failures? How can we apply this to our businesses, our careers, and our lives? This is what we are here to find out. I'm your host, Karthik Chidambaram, CEO of DC Cap. We make systems, talk to each other for manufacturers and distributors. I love to learn and share that knowledge with others. This podcast is about having meaningful conversations that we can all learn from. Thank you for being here, and I hope you enjoy this conversation.
We fail every day, and we learn every day. It's constantly evolving. I learn as much as I do today as I probably did when I was in my first job when I was 15 years old. I mean, you're always learning. If you really want customer engagement and loyalty, you got to have employee engagement and loyalty. And building up companies is usually about growth. You can't grow up a company shrinking to profitability. So how do you grow up companies? How do you go from 3 locations to 25 locations?
You worked with
Howard Schultz.
Yeah. I think he's got a fascinating story. Tell us about your experience working with Howard and what were your learnings there and what did you do for him?
It was the very beginning of Starbucks. And I was hired to help figure out how much to pay Howard Schultz when they went public. And he reached me and said, "Hey, Chernik, I don't like this pay you're suggesting. You're not recommending enough. You must not have compared us to the right companies. If you're rolling out a new idea, if you're trying to convince somebody of something, or you want them to do something new, explain the why to them or ask them the why."
Hello, everyone. Welcome to a brand new episode of Driven by DC Cap podcast. We are here in the Dallas, Texas area, field support office of Building Controls and Solutions. And we're here with Building Controls CEO, Eric Chernik. Eric, thank you for joining the Driven podcast and welcome.
My pleasure.
So Eric, great to have you join the show. I'm really looking forward to the conversation today, and thanks for the office tour as well. I really enjoyed that. Before we talk about building controls, I just want to talk a little bit about your early years growing up. I saw that you went to Stanford. You did your bachelor's there, and you also went to University of Chicago, Booth School of Business. Mm-hmm. So looks like you were a very smart kid growing up. Were you a smart kid growing up, or tell us about your early years?
I grew up in a family that moved around a lot growing up. I grew up with a very well-educated set of parents. My mother was a PhD in clinical psychology. My father was a writer. So I got raised in a family where my father was home taking care of the kids and my mother was out teaching and working. Travel and other cultures was a big part of my upbringing. So learning how to communicate in foreign lands was a big part of my upbringing.
I'm sure that helped a lot as you moved up your career chain. So right after college, you went and started working at Grainger. You were with Grainger for over 12 years, I think, right? So you started with them around 1997 or so. And recently, as you know, David Grainger just passed away. So was that the time where you just joined and he left, or do you have any memories of him?
So I can probably put my career into 3 buckets. So I started as a consultant, a human resource, a people, a compensation consultant before Grainger. Mm-hmm. So I did that for my beginning of my career was all about organizational behavior. Mm-hmm. How do you motivate people? How do you organize work? How do you pay people? How do you recognize? How do you create cultures in a workplace? I decided that after doing human resources that I wanted to get a little broader in my experience and really build a general management career. And I went back to business school at Chicago. And then my first job out of business school was with Grainger. I was looking for companies that would allow me to move around a company from wall to wall, not just be a finance guy, not just be a supply chain guy, not just be a customer service person, but what company would allow me to learn, wall to wall in the company. And Grainger was a great place that, you mentioned Dave Grainger, who recently passed away at age 97. His father started the business, I think back in the 1940s, and a great reputation in the B2B distribution space. And so it was a great place for me to learn about supply chain, about marketing, about strategy, really very customer focused. And so I had a great 13 years of my career there where I started in a branch in Chicago. and I was unloading boxes, and I was learning from the technical experts at the counter. And that's where I really learned that in distribution, or retail, being close to the customer and understanding what their needs are is really, really valuable. My business school colleagues kind of laughed that I was working in a warehouse after business school, but it was a great way for me to understand supply chain and availability of product, and then the technical aspects of some of the products that were more plumbing, electrical, HVAC, whatever they were, to understand what customer kind of challenges that came in the door. And so it was a great experience. A good foundation of my career in distribution was at Grainger.
But why did you choose distribution? Like you said, you could have gone into finance, or you could have gone into a ton of other things. Why did you choose distribution?
I think it was somewhat coincidental. I mean, I really was looking for companies that would allow me to build a general management career for myself. And I talked to companies like Samsung and Toys R Us and R.R. Donnelley and Grainger and a few others. And I just hit it off with the leadership team at Grainger, and they had a leadership development program that was very focused on building cross-functional strength. And so that I kind of fell into B2B distribution.
And right after Grainger, what did you end up doing?
So after Grainger, I spent some time at an aviation supply and logistics company in Chicago called AAR. I moved down to Texas for a private equity-owned company in truck parts, a company called Fleet Pride. I spent some time at Lennox, which is a big heating and air conditioning distribution and manufacturing and distribution company. And then I found this industry. There was a private equity company, Luther King, that asked me to look at a division of one of their larger companies and figure out what to do with it. Should they invest in it? Should they sell it? Should they close it? And the more and more I dug into this building automation space in the commercial world, I thought there's a nice gem of a business here that we can grow up through organic growth strategies, through some acquisitive growth strategies. And here we are 5 years later, and we've gone from 3 locations to 25, from 35 employees to 225 employees. And we're having a great time growing up this company and being an industry leader in this building automation space.
Yeah, I was reading about that. So you were at Grainger. Grainger is obviously a large company. And then here you're building from ground up, right? Pretty much.
Yes.
Like you said, going from 3 to 25 locations.
That's right.
So how does that happen, right? So how did the Grainger experience or some of your other experiences help you? Usually, right? So when you work in a large company, this is my understanding, and I kind of agree with it to a great extent as well, that when you work in a large company, there's not a lot of learning. Sometimes you're limited, so, but how did you apply those learnings, or how did that evolve?
Well, I would say every chapter in my career, there's been best practices and worst practices. And so I'll go from some of the big companies where I've learned some really good practices around how do you manage supply chain. In distribution and in retail, inventory availability and product availability is really important. And so I learned some of those best practices at Grainger. I also learned, standing across the counter and a customer comes in with a motor and the wires are dangling, how do you problem solve? How do you look up stuff? How do you lean on expertise from your colleagues or from the internet or from the catalog? How do you problem solve, with a customer standing in front of you? I learn about marketing techniques in terms of whether it's sales collateral or whether it's demand generating marketing. I've learned about e-commerce from being in different parts of Grainger. So all of these, functions that I'm mentioning, you don't really know it. You can't just read it in a book. You really have to live it and work on a project and work cross-functionally and figure out what the business case is, what's going to have a good return on investment, what's going to have create customer delight. I mean, our businesses are all about customers. And so how do we drive that customer experience to be better, that they choose my company instead of other companies to do business with? If I have a product on the shelf and they need it today, that's one way to drive that customer experience. If they come in with a problem and I help them solve it, that's another way to drive customer experience. If I bundle this product with this product with this product, that's another way to drive customer experience. if I figure out a way for them to save time and money so they don't have to go to 5 different supply houses on 5 different parts of town, or 5 different phone calls, or 5 different invoices, if I can help them one-stop shop, I've added value to their customer experience. And so you can't just read it in a book and say you're an expert at it. So over 30 years in B2B distribution, I've figured out, I can use that, apply what I learned at Grainger in this area. And I can use what I what I learned at Lennox or at Fleet Pride in this aspect. And so it's really cobbling together all these, practices and processes to really help that customer want to do business with us and grow. And that's what we've been successful, at growing the last few years. I've added some teammates to our team, leaders to our team that can bring some even new experiences. I'm a big believer in idea diversification and, diversity of ideas. And you can only get that when you bring in people from other industries or other functions or people that don't think exactly like I think. I don't profess to have all the answers. It's surrounding myself with really good thinkers and strategists and then learn from, like I said, I'll use the word again, best practices that they've had.
Talking about idea diversification, I really love that word. How do you do that, right? Because I think that's a problem a lot of companies, that's a challenge for a lot of companies, right? Because it's usually top down. And but then, like you rightly said, ideas need to come from everywhere. How do you do that? I
don't know if there's any magic answer to that question. I think when we have staff meetings, I throw out questions to the group. I sometimes will give my opinion on something, but I'll ask for their inputs. And I'll ask the same question of 6 people around the room. And I want all 6 answers. I don't want one answer. Because this person is going to learn from that person, and I'm going to learn from both of them. There's probably a smartest guy in the room that maybe has the best answer, but I bet you number 2 person, number 3 person, number 4 person is going to add to that answer. And so I oftentimes look for multiple answers for the same question and then figure out how do we summarize it or prioritize it or phase it in, whatever the solution might be.
Yeah, that's a smart thing to do. One thing I also try to do is, let's say we are having a meeting and somebody's not even talking, you point at that person, hey, Mark, what do you think about this? And then, he might say something, which is really cool,
Oh, you're absolutely right. Some people are more introverted than extroverted, and you have to pull out the introverted and, great answers from people if they're being quiet.
Yeah.
I'm a huge believer in employee engagement, whether it's my leadership team, whether it's the whole company. It's trying to figure out how do you get people engaged with offering answers, getting involved. If you really want customer engagement and loyalty, you got to have employee engagement and loyalty. It goes back to you remember before I said I was, my education was in organizational behavior. That's what I studied in college. That's what I got my master's in. It was all about how do you organize people, how do you motivate, how do you, create processes that are going to be conducive to employee engagement culture. Gaining ideas from our employee population so that they can, help us build our strategies. It's not one person building a strategy. It's really our whole company building the strategy. And then how do we communicate that to our customers back to the point around customer experience being so important?
Yeah, I love it when you said that, it's not one person creating the strategy, right? It's the whole company. You get the team involved and engaged, right? I was reading about this as well. I was also listening to some of your other podcasts. You're very big on employee engagement and leadership, right? A lot of your leadership focuses on that. How do you keep people engaged, right? I think that's, how do you keep people engaged at building controls?
Well, I think there's a few different ways. One is to share a lot of information. More transparency is better than less transparency. So I like to share how the business is doing, how we're growing, where we're learning good practices, where we're maybe struggling. I share the good news and the bad news. So I think transparency and information is very important. And people learn it in different ways. It could be a town hall meeting. It could be a newsletter that they read. It could be their boss sharing information with them. Any number of ways. I think making sure work is organized in a clear way, that people know what's expected of them. Performance goals, performance reviews, development plans. So people know what they're, kind of, supposed to do or expected of them. And the third area is probably, it's more the personal side. How do you get to know the people in your office? What do you talk about in addition to the business work? Showing the empathy and the care for individuals. So probably those three things: communication, job, definition, and kind of empathy and care, are three of the ways I see, engagement comes about.
Yeah, transparency. And one thing I also resonate a lot with what you said is not just sharing the good news, but also share the bad news, right? If something is not going right, just share it with the team. I think people resonate with that and they really appreciate it. So tell us about building controls, right? I mean, probably I should have asked this question a lot earlier, but tell us about building controls, right? So what is that you guys do?
So we are a distributor of building automation products that help commercial buildings run. So think about the building you're sitting in, or think about a school system or a hospital or a rocket ship company. They have to manage their heating and air conditioning. They have to manage their lighting. They have to manage their security. How do all of these things talk to each other? How do you coordinate multiple rooms or multiple buildings on a campus that need to be consistent? In the old days, everything was very manual. You went to the wall and you turned the dial and you managed the temperature in that one room. Over time, and more recently in the last 20, 30 years, you've been able to automate and connect the controllers. You can connect the thermostats or connect the lighting or connect, whatever comfort parts of the building into a smart product that is a control we call controller, that then manages all that rooftop equipment, manages the flow of air and airflow, manages the lights and so forth. And so that's that building automation world that we act as a distributor for. We partner with key manufacturers. So take a Honeywell or a Johnson Controls or a Siemens or Schneider Electric. We take their products and then we teach our customers who are contractors about them. And those contractors do work for these commercial buildings.
So you spent a lot of time, I was just reading a little more, right? You spend a lot of time in private equity as well, and you advise private equity companies, and you also talked about employee engagement, right? Is it harder, employee engagement, is it harder when it comes to private equity companies or not really?
So I think sometimes private equity gets a bad reputation. There's all different kinds of private equity companies. For the most part, they are investment companies that are figuring out how to, return, rewards to their investments. How do they get return on investments? They build up companies, and building up companies is usually about growth. You can't grow up a company shrinking to profitability. So how do you grow up companies? How do you go from 3 locations to 25 locations? How do you go from 35 employees to 225? It's the private equity companies are trusting their CEOs, their leadership teams of the different portfolio companies. So they're providing expertise around mergers and acquisitions. They might be providing expertise around certain functional areas. So if I have a challenge with e-commerce, I may be able to look at my brother and sister companies for expertise around e-commerce, and I can learn from my colleagues. So private equity is more of a board of directors. It's more of a funding mechanism than it is. They're not running the business.
And you talked about acquisitions, right? So you were just 3 locations, and then you grew, and a lot of it happened through acquisitions as well. Can you talk us through that process, right? So what typically goes on when you try to acquire a new company? And obviously, culture is a very, very important thing. How do you ensure, right? Is there like a formula you use, or is there a method you use when you acquire companies? And how do you integrate them with your culture, right? Let's say, for instance, you're acquiring a company, and you talked about transparency, which is very important. But then the other company is not so transparent, the company you're acquiring, right? So does that happen? How do you get them? What does that process look like?
Yeah, so there's a lot of answers to your question there. So even before I think about acquisition, I think about market expansion. I think about, I I can grow geographically. I can grow through new products. I can grow through new services. I can grow through new channels to market. Here are all the ways I could grow. Can I grow that organically in what I'll call greenfield? A few years ago, we put a new branch in Phoenix, Arizona. So that was a greenfield. You heard me talk about Boston. Well, we expanded in the Northeast by acquisitions. So it really depends. You could do it either way. It's probably a little longer to break even and longer to make money if you do it, or if you do it only through greenfields. And so, but sometimes that's the right strategy for a certain part of the model. Other times it's through an acquisition. And yes, you're absolutely right. Culture is very important. So I usually am doing my diligence on the company that we might acquire to figure out, is that going to fit with our culture? They don't have to do everything exactly like us, but do I think the leader is going to mesh well with the rest of our leadership group, and bring new best practices and new ideas and be welcoming of change and change management when our team brings ideas to that person. So I try to assess that ahead of time, talking to other vendors, talking to customers about the company we might be acquiring. And then I work really hard to figure out how, when we merge together, what are we going to communicate together? How are we going to handle the employees, the differences of their jobs, of their pay, of their way of communicating with some of the practices, which I think are best practices that we've been building in our company. When we started this 5 years ago, myself and the CFO were building our integration plans. Now that we're a little bit larger, we have an individual on our team that's an operation leader that has built out a whole playbook for how do we integrate our teams together. I still spend a lot of time on the people side of things and the communications. And then behind the scenes, our operations team figures out the product cleaning and matching up with our product information, our customer information, what are processes in terms of order, everything from inquiry to order, what are our process similarities and differences. And over usually about a 3 to 4 month window, we've integrated those companies, everything from the brand to back-end processes to accounting to payroll, all the different technologies.
Yeah, one thing I've noticed is you guys invest quite a bit on technology and you stay ahead, right? So first off, I want to also thank you for being a DC Cap customer. So I was chatting with our team and I vividly remember this, right? So when you started with us, you were just integrating a couple of systems, right? But then you added more systems and you started, hey, you know what, let's do it. Let's make sure that, seamless automation is required. And you started integrating more systems, even though it costs you more money, right? But it makes it seamless for your end customers, right? So talk about your investments on technology, right? So how do you look at investments in technology?
Yeah, so there's two parts of technology. There's the customer-facing side of technology, and in various parts of this conversation, we've talked about the products that are, technology innovation is very important and taking the next step for our customers in terms of them doing business. But then there's a whole part of technology that's more internal. How do we go from manual processes to automated processes within our business that allows us to service our customers in a more efficient way or a more cost-effective way? So we're just always looking for manual processes and looking to automate, more and more and more. And we do it on the accounting side. We're doing it on the e-commerce side. We're doing it in a number of the supply chain side of things to figure out how do we keep making ourselves better and more efficient. So I can do more, maybe with the same amount of people in the future. As we grow, as we double our size, maybe I don't need to double the size of my workforce. I can, grow it by 50% and still keep up with the volume coming in.
Can you talk us through some of your failures, Eric, and how that helped shape who you are?
We fail every day and we learn every day. And so there's never, it's constantly evolving. I learn as much as I do today as I probably did when I was in my first job when I was 15 years old. I mean, you're always learning. To tell you a funny story, when I was 15, I had a job to run a hotel. And so I ran a 22-room bed and breakfast hotel on the New Jersey shore. And I made a lot of mistakes.
When you were 15?
And customers taught me about those mistakes. I ran a bed and breakfast hotel, and when I put out breakfast, I was thinking the cheapest way possible to put out a breakfast. The frozen muffins and the instant coffee, and that's breakfast for everyone. It's the cheapest way to do it. And once I learned that customers didn't like that, and they gave me some pretty tough feedback about need to go to the bakery, need to put out, percolated coffee, I learned a little bit about customer experience and customer delight, and then kept trying to figure out new ways to enhance that customer experience. Do we put an antique in the bedroom instead of an IKEA piece of furniture? Do we give them fresh towels every day instead of letting them keep the towel for the whole week? Those kinds of things. So that was experimentation, kind of by fire, in my early days of business.
No, I love that, right? So this happened when you were 15,
Yes.
right? But the theme of this podcast is driven, right? So obviously you're not 15 today. And how are you so driven? What keeps you going?
I don't know why I'm so driven. If it's you're born with it or if you develop it, I'm not sure. I was driven when I was running that hotel. I wanted to build up my clientele. I wanted to make money for the business. When I went into consulting after college, I wanted to help my clients be as strong as they could be. I had to figure out how to consult to Starbucks and how much to pay Howard Schultz for executive compensation. I wanted to figure out the right kinds of incentive program for him, Howard, as he was going from a private company to a public company. When I worked with Disney, it was trying to figure out, okay, how do Disney talks about, customer experience and delighting their clients. How do I pull that into job descriptions and what the employees would do based on what their vision was for their client population? I think I've just been, driven to get results, to try new things, to innovate, continuous improvement. Continuous improvement is something we should all be doing in their jobs all the time. And I guess I'm driven to always, continuously improve things around me. In my world today, it's figuring out how do our manufacturer partners team up with us and we team up with our customer. It's kind of that triangle between, supplier, distributor, and and customer. And how do we make that magical experience?
For someone who's not as driven as you are, okay, so what advice would you give them? How can they be driven? Any thoughts around that?
I don't know I think gain a variety of experience. I mean, that would be my advice to someone coming out of college or even grad school or even somewhere middle of their career. How do you gain some more experience? If you've always been in finance, even though you love finance, maybe take a job in supply chain or maybe take a job in emerging technologies just to be in some other people's shoes as well as learn more about your business from another angle or another perspective. And so I'm a big believer in kind of diverse experiences. In college, it might be liberal arts where you take a bunch of different electives. In business, it might be that you move from this function to that function to this function so that you can be stronger overall. You'll have more tools in your toolbox and you can add more value to the company. And maybe you'll find some new passions in some other functions. Again, you hear me talk about the customer a lot. Make sure you get out in the field. Make sure you go talk to customers. Make sure you don't just stay in your office or whether it's your office or your home office, make sure you don't just stay in one place. Meet more people.
Yeah, I love that, right? I think exposure gives you a lot of new things, right? And you try different things. Just don't do the same good thing for too long. So, Eric, you said you worked with
Howard Schultz.
Yeah. I think he's got a fascinating story. I mean, it's a great business, right? Tell us about your experience working with Howard and what were your learnings there and what did you do for him?
So it was a long time ago. It was back when Starbucks was a private company. Believe it or not, they were in 3 cities in the world. They were in Chicago, Seattle, and Portland. So it was the very beginning of Starbucks. And I was hired to help figure out how much to pay Howard Schultz when they went public. So they were getting ready to go public, and I was doing executive compensation consulting. And I did a lot of research about different kinds of emerging companies in the retail space. And I made a recommendation of what to pay Howard Schultz. Little did I know that a few weeks later I would get a phone call, and Howard Schultz was calling to reach my boss. Couldn't reach him, and he reached me and said, "Hey, Chernik, I don't like this pay you're suggesting. You're not recommending enough. You must not have compared us to the right companies." And I learned about the art versus the science of executive compensation, and that, who do you compare to, and what surveys do you use, and what motivating factors. And in compensation, you try to create not just base salary, but various incentives, short-term incentives, long-term incentives, to try to tie to what the vision or the growth or the expectation is, of that company. It was interesting visiting Starbucks. They were, in the early days, very quality focused and very customer experience focused. And so just touring their plant and meeting their VP of quality that would drink some coffee, a cup of coffee out of every batch that went out of the manufacturing plant. I don't know how many cups of coffee that guy had in a day, but it was really interesting to hear the whole leadership team at Starbucks talk about customer experience and then the quality of their product. Now it's evolved over the years, and there's many books that I think Howard Schultz has even written, about the growing up the company. But, in the early days, I could see this entrepreneur that was trying to really focus on customer delight and create that experience different than going to a Dunkin' Donuts or drinking coffee at home. He was trying to create a whole experience in these Starbucks, retail locations.
So customer delight, yeah. When you talked about executive compensation, I have a question on that as well. So, that's a very complicated thing, right? Because sometimes executives are compensated a lot for what they do. Or let's say even if sometimes they're let go for whatever reason, you have to pay them a lot, right?
Yeah.
How does that really work? What is a fair compensation for an executive? How do you determine executive compensation?
Yeah, there are peer comparisons. So you compare to other types of companies in a similar industry. You can look at where that company is in the life cycle of their history. Are they emerging? Are they mature? You really think about compensation in three different ways: base salaries, short-term incentives, and long-term incentives. The most creative piece is on the long-term incentive side of figuring out, okay, what are we tying to? If an executive is going to create a new strategy, is it a one-year strategy? Is it out 5 years? You want the leadership team to be thinking about the long term, not just about short term. The annual bonuses take care of the short term. The long-term incentives kind of really impact kind of longer term strategies. And some of these strategies are not always in parallel, in concert. And so there is sometimes some friction between long-term strategies and then short-term earnings and, and short-term, kind of results. Private companies have certain kinds of executive compensation programs. Public companies have different kinds of compensation. And as an executive, they're also thinking about things like severance and change of control when there's a change of control. So there's a lot of complexities that come into executive compensation.
Yeah, like short-term incentives focused on the short-term growth, and then you have long-term incentives focused on the long-term growth. Yeah.
And sometimes you read the newspapers and you see, wow, that person made $30 million. Was that really worth it? But it was linked and tied to some metric that the board of directors thought was important for compensation and for that individual. And it is a supply and demand world out there. So if you don't hire them, if you don't pay them well, they may get a job at your competitor, making that big money.
Yeah, I think we can have a whole new podcast on that. I would like to end with this question, Eric. How do you keep yourself updated, or what book are you reading right now?
I'm reading a couple books right now. Well, I just finished a book that I like that I've read recently. A couple books by Simon Sinek.
Yeah.
He asked the question, why?
Start with why.
And so it's always, try to figure, if you're rolling out a new idea, if you're trying to convince somebody of something, or you want them to do something new, explain the why to them or ask them the why. I think that's a good book. So I read a lot of business books, but then I also read some books just about history. I'm reading a book right now written by H.R. McMaster, who was part of kind of our defense team over the years. Comes out of the Army, and he's describing his kind of 1 year working in the Trump's administration before he was fired. But it's interesting to hear the political and social aspects of what goes on in politics and really the history of our, the backbone of our country. Absolutely. So a couple interesting books.
Yeah, I did read the other book you were talking about, right? Start with Why, and I totally relate with it, right? Because I enjoyed Simon Sinek's writing, where he talks about, hey, anything you do, just start with why. And now, anytime I do something, I just ask that question: hey, why am I doing it? And does it make sense in the long term? So, Eric, I really enjoyed this conversation. Thank you so much for your time. It was a great conversation for me, and there was a ton of learning. I'm sure it was the same for the audience as well. So, thank you so much for joining the Driven podcast.
You're welcome. It's been fun. Thank you.
Thank you for joining our Driven by DC Cap podcast. Your support means a lot to us. If you enjoyed this episode, please click the like button and subscribe. Consider leaving us a review. Thank you for joining us.